Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the perfumed shadows of history's most powerful palaces, where young men reclined on silk cushions, their beauty carefully curated, their influence rarely recorded in official chronicles. You're walking past marble columns and through beaded curtains into chambers where empires bent to whispered advice given in the dark hours before dawn. These weren't the warriors whose statues line public squares, or the merchants whose trade routes appear in textbooks. These were the favourites, the companions, the concubines, whose very existence makes modern historians shift uncomfortably in their chairs. You probably won't survive the cognitive dissonance of realising how much world-shaping policy was decided by men whose primary qualification was being extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily careful. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 am? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together, here on Timeless Sleep. You find yourself standing in a corridor you shouldn't officially know exists. The year doesn't matter yet, because this hallway appears across centuries, across continents, in palaces separated by oceans and languages, but connected by a single thread of human behaviour. Power concentrates, and where power concentrates, it seeks comfort, beauty, distraction, and the particular vulnerability that comes with intimate companionship. The door before you is smaller than the grand public entrances, carved with less obvious decoration, positioned where visiting dignitaries won't accidentally glimpse what lies beyond. You push it open and enter a world that exists in the margins of every history book you ever read in school, present in the gaps between sentences, implied in the careful phrasing of ancient chroniclers who wrote for audiences that would punish certain truths. The room is smaller than you expected, though still larger than any chamber a common person would occupy. Silk hangings filter the afternoon light into something golden and warm. Cushions are arranged with the kind of precision that suggests servants have been trained exactly how to place them, exactly which corner of each pillow should catch the light. Incense burns in a corner, not the heavy temple incense, but something lighter, designed to cling to skin and hair without overwhelming. A low table holds wine in a jewelled cup, fruit arranged to look casual but clearly selected for colour and symbolism. This is a stage set for intimacy, but intimacy as a form of statecraft. The young man reclining against the cushions is perhaps 18, perhaps 20, with the kind of face that makes artists reach for their tools and poets reach for inadequate metaphors. His beauty isn't accidental. He was selected for it, perhaps purchased because of it, certainly elevated to this position, because someone with institutional power looked at him and saw an opportunity. His skin has been oiled until it glows in the filtered light. His hair has been arranged by hands other than his own. The single piece of jewellery he wears, a pendant or ring or armband depending on which century and culture you're visiting, cost more than a farmer would earn in a lifetime. He looks relaxed, but you notice his eyes track the door, the window, the positions of furniture that could provide cover or escape. He has learnt to wear ease like a costume, while remaining fundamentally alert. You're not looking at a historical anomaly or a scandal buried in footnotes. You're looking at an institution, a pattern that repeats across human civilization with remarkable consistency. When historians write about harems, they almost exclusively discuss women, filling pages with analysis of concubines, favourites, and the politics of royal reproduction. The presence of young men in similar positions gets a sentence if it's lucky, a footnote if the historian is being thorough, and more often complete silence, as if acknowledging their existence might complicate narratives we prefer to keep simple. But the archaeology doesn't cooperate with our preferences. The private quarters of palaces include chambers clearly designed for individuals who weren't wives, weren't official heirs, and weren't women. The account books list expenditures for wardrobes, perfumes, and gifts given to young men whose official titles translate roughly to companion, cupbearer, or the elegantly vague favourite. The practice wasn't hidden in the way we might assume. In many cultures, the presence of attractive young men in positions close to power was simply understood, discussed in poetry and artwork with the same casual acceptance that official wives received. A Roman emperor's beloved freedman might appear in state processions. A Chinese emperor's favoured attendant might wield influence that ministers approached with the same careful diplomacy they'd use with any power broker. A Persian king's wine-bearer might be painted into official murals, his beauty celebrated in court verses. The secrecy came later, applied retroactively by cultures that needed their history to look a certain way. Victorian translators turned love poems into odes to friendship. Nationalist historians transformed intimate companions into loyal servants. Museum placards described bedroom artwork as depicting bodyguards or pages, technically true but deliberately incomplete. The young man in front of you shifts position, and you notice the way the movement has been practiced, calculated to appear natural while displaying his form to advantage. Everything about his presentation is deliberate, from the angle of his reclining position to the way the light catches his collarbone. He's a work of art, but he's also a politician, an investor gambling his youth and beauty in markets where the currency is access and the stakes are survival. He might have been born free and recruited with promises of advancement. He might have been enslaved, purchased specifically for this role from traders who specialized in such acquisitions. He might have been offered by his own family, a younger son with a pretty face sent to court the way daughters were sent, a piece moved on the board of dynastic ambition. What you're witnessing isn't simple or easy to categorize using modern frameworks. There's exploitation here, absolutely, the kind that should make your stomach clench. There's also agency, strategy, and occasionally genuine affection blooming in spaces designed for transaction. There's survival, the kind of cold-eyed calculation that people make when their options are limited and their beauty is the most valuable asset they possess. The young man meets your eyes, and in his gaze you see calculation, wariness, intelligence, and something that might be exhaustion beneath the practiced seduction. He's performing a role that might elevate him above poverty, that might give him influence in imperial decisions, that might also discard him the moment his youth fades or his patron's attention shifts. He exists in a space between privilege and profound vulnerability, wielding power that could evaporate with a single whispered rumour or a new arrival with a prettier smile. You're standing now in the oldest cities humanity ever built, where ziggurats rise against desert skies and temples dominate the landscape like mountains made deliberate. This is Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where civilization itself is being invented one clay tablet at a time. The year is somewhere around 2400 BCE, give or take a century, because precision matters less here than pattern, and the pattern you're witnessing will repeat for millennia. The temple complex sprawls before you, its mud brick walls thick enough to stay cool even as the sun turns the world outside into something shimmering and hostile. You pass through courtyards where priests perform rituals that blend what we'd call religion and government into a single inseparable institution. The temple isn't just a place of worship, but the centre of economic power, controlling grain stores and trade routes, employing hundreds, wielding influence that kings must negotiate with rather than command. In a smaller courtyard, away from the main ritual spaces but still within the sacred precincts, young men are being prepared. They range in age from mid-teens to early 20s, their bodies marked by the kind of careful maintenance that speaks to institutional investment. They're being bathed by attendants, their skin scrubbed with mixtures of oil and finely ground minerals that leave them gleaming. Their hair is being arranged in the elaborate styles that temple iconography will later immortalize in stone carvings. They wear linen that manages to be both ceremonially appropriate and deliberately revealing, draped to suggest rather than conceal. These are temple servants, but that phrase doesn't capture the full complexity of their role. In Sumerian and Akkadian, the words used for certain classes of temple attendants carry connotations that our translations flatten into blandness. The terms suggest beauty, youth, service that is both sacred and intimate. The theological framework that justifies their presence is genuinely believed by most people you'd ask in this city. The gods require service, and service takes many forms. There are priests who perform sacrifices and priestesses who maintain eternal flames. There are musicians who play during rituals and scribes who record divine pronouncements. And there are these young men whose beauty is understood as a gift offered to the divine, whose bodies become vessels through which the gods experience pleasure, and through that pleasure look favourably upon the city. It's not a metaphor to the people performing these rituals. The sacred marriage ceremonies, where priests or priestesses representing deities engage in ritual intercourse, are understood as literal moments when divine forces enter the material world. The young men prepared in this courtyard will participate in variations of these ceremonies, their role somewhere between offering and intermediary. What makes your modern sensibilities particularly uncomfortable is that this system doesn't present itself as exploitative. There's no sneaking or shame in the official framework. Families from certain social classes consider it an honour to have a son selected for temple service of this kind. The young men themselves, at least in the documents that survive, sometimes speak of their roles with apparent pride. A fragmentary poem from the period describes a youth's dedication to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, in language that blends devotional ecstasy with sensual anticipation. Whether that pride is genuine or performed for an audience that could punish dissent is impossible to know across 4,000 years. You're looking at a system that has woven exploitation into the sacred so thoroughly that extracting one from the other would require unmaking the entire cosmology. But temples aren't the only venues for this practice. In the palaces that rise near the temple complexes, kings maintain their own households of beautiful attendants. The distinction between sacred and royal becomes blurry because kings in this period often claim divine ancestry or divine appointment. A king's pleasure and a god's pleasure exist on a spectrum rather than in separate categories. The young men who serve in palace chambers are selected with the same care as temple servants, their beauty assessed, their training rigorous. They learn to pour wine without spilling, to play instruments that soothe, to arrange their bodies in ways that please. They also learn the more dangerous skills, how to read moods, when to speak and when silence serves better, how to remember everything they overhear without appearing to listen. Some of these attendants appear in royal correspondence, mentioned in the context of gifts exchanged between allied kings. A Babylonian king sends a particularly beautiful youth to an Egyptian pharaoh as part of a diplomatic arrangement. The young man listed in the inventory alongside gold and lapis lazuli, his value calculated in similar terms. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1750 BC, doesn't spend much time on concubines of either gender, but the laws it does include reveal assumptions about how these relationships function. There are provisions about inheritance, about the status of children born to secondary wives versus slaves, about what happens when a man takes a tavern girl as a concubine. The language is frustratingly imprecise about male concubines, not because they don't exist, but because the legal framework seems uncertain how to categorize them. They appear in the gaps, in laws about slaves who share their master's bed, in regulations about temple servants whose status is neither fully free nor fully enslaved. The legal ambiguity mirrors social ambiguity. These young men occupy a space the law hasn't quite figured out how to define, which leaves them simultaneously protected by proximity to power and vulnerable to its whims. You watch as one of the young men in the temple courtyard is led away by a senior priest. The youth's face shows careful blankness, the expression of someone who has learned that showing too much emotion, positive or negative, can be dangerous. He's maybe 16, his body still carrying the last softness of adolescence that will harden into adult angles in another year or two. His peak value is now, in this moment of youth, that cultures across history will fetishize with remarkable consistency. In 5 years, if he's lucky, he might transition into a teaching role, training the next generation of temple servants. If he's unlucky, he'll be discarded, sent back to whatever family sold or dedicated him, his brief elevation over. The really unlucky ones won't survive. Temple records occasionally note deaths among the servants, usually without detail, the causes left to imagination. Disease, violence took their own life, the grinding stress of performing desirability while having no control over your own body, any of these could explain the gaps in the rosters. What survives in the archaeological record is fragmentary and requires interpretation that scholars argue over in footnotes. Clay tablets list expenditures for cosmetics and garments for male temple servants. Cylinder seals show young men in poses of service or submission near figures, clearly marked as divine or royal. Mesopotamian literature includes poems where male beauty is praised with the same elaborate metaphors used for female beauty: skin like alabaster, eyes like precious stones, limbs compared to cedar trees or gazelles. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, includes Enkidu, whose creation involves a temple prostitute civilizing him through 7 days of intercourse. Later in the same epic, Gilgamesh's relationship with Enkidu is described in language intimate enough that translators have spent centuries debating whether to read it as deep friendship or something more physically entangled. The ambiguity might be ours rather than theirs. The categories we use to separate platonic from sensual, sacred from profane, service from slavery, might not map onto their understanding at all. You turn from the temple courtyard and walk toward the ziggurat, its massive stepped form dominating the city centre. Somewhere in the chambers within, a young man is performing a role that is simultaneously religious duty, political necessity, and personal survival strategy. You might be whispering prayers or moaning in pleasure or lying perfectly still, while someone with institutional power takes what they want. All three might be happening simultaneously, indistinguishable within a framework that has sanctified certain forms of use. The rivers that give Mesopotamia its name continue their slow flow toward the sea, carrying silt that will build deltas and destroy them, the same cycles of creation and erosion that apply to civilizations. This pattern you're witnessing, young men valued for beauty and deployed in the service of power, will survive long after these particular cities crumble into tells for archaeologists to excavate. It's being established here in the earliest complex societies as a fundamental technology of power, refined and transmitted across generations with the same care given to bronze working or astronomy. You're walking now through corridors so vast they seem designed to remind you of your own insignificance, past lacquered pillars that rise towards ceilings painted with dragons and phoenixes locked in eternal celestial dance. This is the Forbidden City, though you're also somehow simultaneously in the palaces of earlier dynasties, because the pattern you're tracing threads through Chinese history with remarkable consistency. The air smells of sandalwood, and the particular mustiness that comes from rooms where sunlight is rationed like gold. Eunuchs glide past you in their distinctive robes, their movements silent, their faces carefully neutral. What gets discussed less often, what tends to disappear in the popular imagination's focus on eunuchs and concubines, are the other young men, the ones who remained intact, who served the emperor in capacities that official histories describe with elegant vagueness. The term you keep encountering in the documents is companion, or sometimes attendant of the inner chambers, phrases that could mean almost anything, and therefore provide perfect cover for meaning something specific. During the Han Dynasty, which stretched from 206 BCE to 220 C, imperial records mention young men appointed to positions near the emperor with job descriptions that amount to be beautiful and available. The official histories, written by Confucian scholars who had complicated feelings about acknowledging such matters, use circumlocutions. They describe an emperor's particular fondness for a certain young courtier. They note that a handsome youth was frequently summoned to the imperial presence or attended the emperor in his private hours. These phrases appear in the same tone that might describe a gardening hobby, bland language, wrapped around information that everyone at court understood perfectly well. Emperor Ai of Han, who ruled from 7 to 1 BC, provides one of the more explicitly documented examples, though even here the sources dance around direct statement. He had an empress, as required by protocol and the necessity of producing heirs, but his documented affection centered on a young man named Dong Xian. The histories record that Dong Xian was promoted with unusual speed through court ranks, despite having no particular administrative gifts. He was given estates, titles and access that made him one of the most powerful individuals in the empire. The famous story, which appears in multiple sources and has become a literary touchstone, describes the emperor waking from a nap to find Dong Xian asleep on the sleeve of his robe. Rather than disturb his companion, the emperor cut off his own sleeve, an act of tenderness that spawned the phrase "the passion of the cut sleeve," which became classical Chinese literature's coded way of referring to love between men. What makes this story particularly telling is that it's recorded without scandal in the official histories. The historians note it as evidence of the emperor's excessive favouritism, which they consider politically problematic because it elevated someone unworthy, but they don't present the relationship itself as shocking or transgressive. The issue isn't that the emperor loves a man, but that he loves this particular man too much, allowing personal attachment to override political wisdom. It's a complaint about judgment, not about the gender of the emperor's beloved. This distinction matters because it reveals assumptions about how power and intimacy could intertwine. An emperor was expected to have favourites. The problem arose when favouritism distorted governance, when a beautiful companion accumulated power that should have been distributed more strategically. You move through the palace gardens, designed with the kind of calculated naturalism that requires armies of gardeners to maintain the illusion of spontaneity. Here, under pavilions or beside carefully positioned rocks, emperors throughout Chinese history met with young men whose presence wouldn't be recorded in appointment books. Some of these youths came from noble families, younger sons sent to court in hopes of advancement. Exceptional beauty could elevate a family's standing as effectively as military service or administrative competence, though the path was less celebrated in official narratives. A son who caught the emperor's eye might bring patents of nobility, tax exemptions, or advantageous marriage arrangements for his sisters. Families played this game with the same strategic calculation they applied to any other form of court politics, weighing the potential rewards against the risks of spectacular failure if their son fell from favour. Other young men arrived through more coercive pathways. The tribute system that brought goods and people from provinces and vassal states sometimes included beautiful youths selected specifically for imperial pleasure. Korean and Vietnamese sources occasionally mention young men sent as tribute, their beauty assessed like the quality of silk or the purity of jade. Within China itself, local officials seeking favour might present a particularly attractive boy from their region, the youth becoming a gift designed to cement political relationships. These weren't adoption scenarios. Everyone involved understood the nature of the transaction, the young man's body serving as the medium through which loyalty was demonstrated and patronage secured. The Ming dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644, left more detailed records of the inner court's organisation, and those records include positions that clearly designate attractive young men. There were the official servants, eunuchs whose roles were documented and regulated, but also what the records call extra statutory attendants, young men who appeared on no official roster but whose presence was maintained through discretionary imperial funds. They lived in quarters near the emperor's private chambers. They received education in arts considered refined, calligraphy, music, poetry. They were dressed in fine silks and fed from the imperial kitchens. In return, they provided companionship that ranged from conversation to more intimate services, the specific nature left unspecified in documents, but clear enough from context. What's remarkable is how this system coexisted with Confucian ideology that officially emphasized hetero-intimate marriage and filial piety focused on producing male heirs. The tension was managed through a kind of public-private split. Official ideology celebrated emperors as devoted to empress and concubines, producing sons to continue the dynasty. Private reality, the world behind the vermilion walls, allowed for considerably more complexity. Palace memoirs and the journals of court officials occasionally lift the curtain. A Ming dynasty courtier's diary mentions encountering a beautiful youth leaving the emperor's chambers at dawn. A Qing dynasty document lists expenditures for special attendants that mirror the budgets for female concubines. These glimpses appear without fanfare, suggesting that what might seem scandalous to outside observers was simply understood court practice to insiders. The young men themselves navigated a world of extraordinary luxury and equally extraordinary precarity. A favourite might wield influence that generals and ministers had to respect, his whispered word in the emperor's ear capable of making or destroying careers. The most successful learned to translate imperial favour into concrete security, titles that couldn't be easily revoked, land grants that provided income independent of current status, strategic marriages that allied them with powerful families. The less strategic found themselves discarded when their youth faded or when a new arrival caught the imperial eye. Unlike female concubines, these young men couldn't produce children who might justify continued support. Their value was entirely tied to their ability to please, and youth's advantage inevitably declined. Some survived their fall with grace, transitioning into advisory roles or retiring to estates accumulated during their ascendancy. Others vanished from the records entirely, their fates unrecorded and probably grim. Palace histories occasionally mentioned took their own lives among former favourites, young men who faced the loss of status and couldn't imagine life after imperial favour. The psychological toll of being valued primarily for beauty and physical availability, of knowing that ageing would erase your utility, of spending years in a state of permanent performance, must have been crushing. You're looking at young men, remember, often recruited in their mid-teens, trained to subordinate their own desires entirely to another person's pleasure, rewarded lavishly for successful self-erasure. The Qing dynasty, China's last imperial house ruling from 1644 to 1912, continued these practices even as increasing contact with European powers introduced new frameworks for judgment. Jesuit missionaries writing home described the Qing court with fascinated horror, noting the presence of beautiful young men in contexts that made their function clear. These accounts were often used to paint Chinese civilization as decadent and morally compromised, conveniently ignoring that European courts had their own traditions of royal favourites and kept boys. The missionary criticism tells us more about European anxieties than Chinese practices, revealing how the same behaviours could be described as refined culture or deplorable vice depending on who was doing the describing and what political purpose the description served. You're standing now in a palace where every surface gleams with the wealth of an empire that stretches from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, where gold leaf catches lamplight and throws it back in 1,000 shimmering reflections. This is Persepolis, or perhaps Susa, or maybe Ctesiphon, because the Persian Empire reinvents itself across centuries while maintaining certain core practices with remarkable consistency. The Achaemenid Persians who built this particular palace understood luxury as a form of statecraft, every artistic choice designed to communicate imperial power to visitors who would return home with stories of splendour that exceeded imagination. You walk across floors of polished stone, past walls carved with processions of tribute bearers, through courtyards where fountains play and gardens bloom with flowers cultivated thousands of miles away just to prove it could be done. Somewhere in these chambers, a young man is preparing for the evening's banquet, his role both ceremonial and profoundly practical. The position of cupbearer appears throughout Persian history with a consistency that suggests institutional importance. The role sounds minor in translation, someone who pours wine, but that simple description misses everything that matters. The cupbearer stands at the king's shoulder during feasts. He tastes the wine before it reaches the royal lips, a human early warning system against poison. He's close enough to hear conversations that shape imperial policy, near enough to observe who approaches the king and how those approaches are received. He's also, not coincidentally, usually very beautiful, selected from the ranks of noble families or sometimes from among conquered peoples specifically for his appearance. Ancient sources describe the cupbearer role with language that emphasizes youth, beauty and grace. Xenophon, the Greek historian and soldier who spent time at the Persian court, writes about cupbearers with barely concealed appreciation for their physical attributes, describing the elaborate ritual of wine service as a kind of performance designed to display the cupbearer's elegance. The most famous biblical cupbearer is probably Nehemiah, who served the Persian king Artaxerxes I around 445 B before being appointed governor of Judah. The book of Nehemiah describes him approaching the king to request permission to rebuild Jerusalem, and the text notes that Nehemiah had never before been sad in the king's presence. That detail reveals the emotional labour involved. A cupbearer was expected to be perpetually pleasant, his mood calibrated to enhance rather than dampen the royal experience. Nehemiah's exceptional access to the king, his ability to make requests that were granted, speaks to the intimacy of the position. This wasn't a servant who appeared, poured and vanished. This was someone who spent hours in the king's company, whose presence was valued beyond the functional task of wine service. Greek sources, which provide much of what we know about Persian court life, because the Persians themselves left fewer detailed personal records, are fairly explicit about the intimate dimension of these relationships. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier accounts, describes how Persian kings selected the most beautiful boys from among noble families to serve as cupbearers and attendants. He notes that these youths were trained not just in wine service but in conversation, music and the arts of pleasing. The language Plutarch uses doesn't leave much room for ambiguity. He describes these young men as the king's eromenos, a Greek term specifically denoting the younger partner in a pederastic relationship. Whether Plutarch is accurately describing Persian practice or projecting Greek customs onto a foreign court is debated by scholars, but the archaeological and artistic evidence suggests he's not entirely inventing. Persian art from the Achaemenid period shows young male attendants in positions of intimacy near royal figures. Relief carvings depict beardless youths holding fly whisks or fans, standing close enough to the seated king to touch him. The absence of beards is significant in Persian iconography, where facial hair marked adult masculine status. These smooth-faced youths occupy a liminal category, beautiful precisely because they haven't yet crossed into full masculine adulthood. Later Persian miniature paintings, from the Safavid period in the 16th and 17th centuries, are even more explicit, showing beautiful young wine-bearers in garden settings, with compositions that emphasize their physical appeal. Some of these paintings accompanied poetry that celebrated the beauty of young men with the same elaborate metaphors used in love poetry: the beloved's face compared to the moon, his hair to night, his cruel indifference to the suffering of his admirers. The wine itself, which the cupbearer serves, carries its own symbolic weight in Persian culture. Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of pre-Islamic Persia, had complicated relationships with intoxication, but in court contexts wine represented refined pleasure, an indulgence that separated civilized luxury from barbaric excess. The ritual of wine service became an opportunity for display. The cupbearer would approach with the vessel held just so, his movements practiced to achieve a kind of choreographed grace. He would pour a small amount, drink it himself to demonstrate its safety, then fill the king's cup and present it with gestures that were part ceremony, part seduction. The king's acceptance of the cup wasn't just about quenching thirst, but about participating in a ritual that reaffirmed the cupbearer's devotion and the king's power to command beauty into service. The danger of the position was considerable, though in different ways than the poison tasting function might suggest. Yes, there was the literal risk of actually encountering poison, dying in the king's place as a human cannery. But the greater danger was navigating court politics while being visibly favoured. A beautiful cupbearer accumulated enemies almost automatically. Nobles whose advice was ignored while a young man's pillow talk suggestions were implemented resented the inversion of what they considered proper hierarchy. Rivals for the king's attention, both male and female, saw the favoured cupbearer as an obstacle to their own advancement. Religious authorities, particularly as Zoroastrian influence waxed and waned, sometimes objected to the presence of male favourites as contrary to proper order, though these objections seem to have been ignored when inconvenient. We watch as a cupbearer, perhaps 17 years old with the kind of bone structure that suggests Central Asian ancestry, prepares for the evening. Servants have bathed him in water perfumed with rose and saffron. His hair has been arranged in elaborate curls that took an hour to achieve. He wears robes of silk so fine they're nearly transparent in certain lights, the fabric dyed with Tyrian purple that cost more than a common soldier's annual salary. Gold bracelets circle his wrists, gifts from the king that signal favour to everyone who sees them. His eyes are lined with kohl, not because Persian men typically wore cosmetics, but because he occupies a special category where different rules apply. He's being transformed into a living work of art, his natural beauty enhanced through techniques usually reserved for religious statuary or the most elite women. The Greek historian Curtius Rufus, writing about Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia, describes how the young Macedonian king adopted many Persian court customs, including the practice of keeping beautiful young attendants. Alexander's relationship with Hephaestion was already well established before he encountered Persian customs, but his later favourites included Persian youths who had served the previous king. Bagoas, a Persian eunuch of exceptional beauty, became one of Alexander's known companions. The sources describe Bagoas performing a dance at a banquet that so pleased Alexander that the king pulled the youth down to kiss him, an act that made the assembled Macedonians cheer. The fact that this incident is recorded suggests it was notable but not scandalous, a public display of affection that crossed some boundary of expected behaviour but didn't violate fundamental taboos. What's instructive about the Persian model is how explicitly it acknowledged what other cultures left implicit. Greek and Roman sources criticise Persian kings for being overly luxurious and soft, and part of that critique centres on their open enjoyment of beautiful young men. The criticism reveals the critic's anxieties more than Persian practice. The Persians built an empire that lasted for centuries by being effective administrators and formidable warriors, not by being weak or decadent. Their incorporation of beautiful young men into court life didn't undermine military effectiveness or administrative competence. It was simply a feature of how they organised intimacy and power, different from Greek or Roman approaches, but no less functional. The cupbearer finishes his preparations and moves toward the banquet hall, his steps measured, his expression serene. He's carrying wine that might be poisoned, entering a room full of people who may wish him harm, preparing to spend hours standing in physical positions that will leave him aching by midnight, all while maintaining an appearance of effortless grace. His beauty is his tool and his burden. It opened doors that would otherwise remain closed, but made him vulnerable in ways that people valued for other skills might avoid. If he's wise, he's already thinking about his future, about how to translate ephemeral favour into lasting security. If he's lucky, he'll survive long enough to accumulate wealth and retire to a provincial estate. If he's unlucky, he'll vanish into the footnotes, another beautiful youth whose name appears once in a chronicle before disappearing forever, his fate unrecorded and ultimately irrelevant to the grand narratives of empire. You're walking through the agora as morning light slants across marble columns, past philosophers arguing in the shade and merchants hawking oil and honey, into a world where the relationship between older men and beautiful youths isn't whispered about, but celebrated in poetry, debated in symposia, and regulated by laws that attempted to distinguish acceptable from shameful forms. This is Athens during its golden age, or perhaps Rome during the Republic, because while Greek and Roman attitudes toward these relationships differed in important ways, they shared enough common ground that you can move between them and recognize the same underlying patterns. The air smells of olive oil and unwashed bodies, bread baking, and the particular dusty heat that Mediterranean cities exhale. You're heading toward a house where a wealthy man reclines on a couch, and a youth of exceptional beauty sits nearby. Their relationship understood by everyone who sees them, but categorized in ways that modern labels don't quite capture. The Greek institution of pederasty, the romantic and intimate relationship between an adult man and an adolescent boy, was woven into the social fabric so thoroughly that pretending it didn't involve concubinage requires willful blindness. The idealized version, the one that appears in Plato's Symposium and in countless vast paintings, presents these relationships as educational and reciprocal. An older Erastes, the lover, would pursue a younger Eromenos, the beloved, offering gifts, attention, and mentorship. The youth would resist initially, because being too eager suggested mercenary motives, but eventually accept the relationship. The Erastes would guide the Eromenos toward virtue, teaching him philosophy, rhetoric, and the qualities needed for citizenship. In return, the Eromenos would provide companionship and, delicately implied, physical gratification, though the exact nature of acceptable intimate contact was hedged with restrictions designed to preserve the youth's masculine honour. That's the idealized framework, the version that lets modern scholars write about ancient Greek love with soft-focus romanticism. The reality, glimpsed in court cases and comic plays, and the kinds of sources that weren't trying to present an elevated philosophical picture, was considerably messier and often explicitly transactional. The distinction between the idealized pederastic relationship and straightforward prostitution was supposed to be that free citizens engaged in the former, while slaves and foreigners performed the latter, but the boundary was porous and frequently crossed. Wealthy men maintained young male slaves specifically for intimate purposes, a practice so common that it required no explanation in the literature. These enslaved youths weren't being educated in virtue or mentored toward citizenship. They were concubines, owned property whose purpose was providing intimate service. Athenian law tried to protect free citizen youths from being reduced to the status of prostitutes, because a citizen who sold his body for money lost certain civic rights. The concern wasn't morality in a modern sense, but maintaining status boundaries. A free Athenian youth who accepted payment for sex was committing an act that feminized him, that placed him in the category of people who were penetrated, which in the Greek gender framework meant he was compromising his future masculine citizenship. But a youth who accepted gifts as part of a pederastic relationship, who received a cloak or a rooster or an invitation to a symposium, that was acceptable because the exchange was framed as affection rather than commerce. The line between gift and payment was precisely where status anxiety concentrated, and court speeches suggest that accusations of having prostituted oneself were serious slander that required aggressive defence. What this meant in practice was that beauty became a form of capital that youths could invest, and the returns varied wildly depending on how skillfully they played the game. A strikingly beautiful boy from a poor but free family might attract the attention of a wealthy Erastes who would shower him with gifts, introduce him to influential men, and effectively subsidize his entry into adult civic life. This was concubinage wearing the mask of mentorship, a transactional relationship disguised as pedagogical eros. The youth traded his beauty and body during the years of his physical peak for connections and resources that would serve him after his desirability faded. If he was strategic, he transitioned from Eromenos to Erastes himself, using the network he'd built to establish himself in business or politics, perhaps maintaining a beautiful youth of his own to demonstrate his status. The less fortunate youths, those without freedom, or those whose beauty wasn't quite exceptional enough to attract elite patrons, worked in contexts that ancient sources describe with casual cruelty. Brothels in Athens and other Greek cities housed male prostitutes alongside female ones, with the males sometimes commanding higher prices if they were particularly attractive or skilled. These weren't the philosophically elevated relationships depicted in Plato. These were commercial transactions, brief encounters purchased for a few obols, providing income for the prostitute or, more often, for the brothel owner who controlled them. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii, which preserves a Roman city frozen in 79C, includes graffiti advertising male prostitutes, listing their specialties and prices with the same directness used for any other service. Rome took the Greek model and adapted it with characteristic Roman pragmatism, maintaining the practice while adjusting the ideology. Roman men of status kept slave boys called delicati or concubini, beautiful youths who served decorative and intimate functions. Martial and Juvenal, Roman poets known for their satirical bite, write about these relationships with a mixture of acceptance and mockery. Martial describes a wealthy man's beautiful slave boy with appreciation for the youth's appearance, while also mocking the owner's obvious infatuation. The mockery isn't about the practice itself, but about losing emotional control, about letting affection for a slave boy compromise the dignified detachment expected of a Roman master. You were supposed to use your attractive slaves, but was understood as one of the perks of ownership. You weren't supposed to fall in love with them or elevate them above their station in ways that disrupted household hierarchy. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with Antinous, a youth from Bithynia, represents the most famous Roman example of a male concubine elevated to extraordinary prominence. Antinous appears to have been around 13 when he entered Hadrian's household, and the emperor's devotion to the beautiful youth became the talk of the empire. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130C, Hadrian's grief was so intense it became political liability. The emperor founded a city named Antinopolis at the site of the death. He had Antinous deified, establishing a cult that spread throughout the Eastern Empire. Hundreds of statues were commissioned, showing Antinous with the idealized beauty of classical sculpture, his curls carefully rendered, his expression serene. These weren't hidden tributes. They stood in public spaces, in temples and forums, physical manifestations of an emperor's love for a youth who had been, functionally, his concubine. What's striking about the Hadrian and Antinous story is how it was received. Some senators grumbled about the excessive honours given to a mere boy, and some critics suggested the deification was inappropriate, but the relationship itself wasn't treated as scandalous. Hadrian had a wife, Sabina, as imperial protocol required. He also had Antinous, and contemporaries seem to have accepted both relationships as normal features of imperial life. The criticism focused on the intensity of Hadrian's grief and the extravagance of the posthumous honours, not on the fact that the emperor kept a beautiful young male lover. This acceptance tells you something important about Roman attitudes. They weren't identical to Greek attitudes, and they certainly weren't modern attitudes, but they created space for relationships that we would classify as concubinage, even as they maintained ideologies of masculine dominance that required careful framing. You're standing now in a Roman villa, watching as a dominus, a master of the household, summons one of his slave boys. The youth is perhaps 15, his body showing the lean muscle of adolescence, his face pretty in a way that won't survive his 20s. He approaches with downcast eyes, practiced submission, the body language of someone who has learned that his survival depends on pleasing. The master touches the boy's chin, tilts his face up to catch the light, examines him with the casual possessiveness of someone assessing property. There's no pretense here of education or mentorship. This is ownership, the absolute power that Roman law granted masters over slave bodies. The youth will follow the master to his cubiculum, the private sleeping chamber, and what happens there is entirely at the master's discretion. If the boy is lucky, the master is relatively kind, quick in his use, generous with small rewards. If he's unlucky, the master is cruel, or worse, the master will tire of him and sell him to someone whose tastes run to inflicting pain. The philosophical texts and the elevated poetry present pederasty as something beautiful, a relationship that ennobles both participants. The legal texts and the satirical sources reveal a reality where beauty was currency and youths were commodities, where the same culture that produced Plato's elevation of homosexual love also maintained slave markets, where children were sold explicitly for physical use. Both realities coexisted, not in tension but as different expressions of the same underlying system. Power concentrated in the hands of adult citizen men, and that power included physical access to those beneath them in the hierarchy: women, slaves, foreigners, and youths. The ideological framework that made some relationships elevated and educational, while others were sordid and commercial, served primarily to maintain status distinctions, to separate citizen from slave, Greek from barbarian, Roman from provincial. You're stepping now through carved wooden screens into courtyards where fountains murmur and orange trees perfume the air, into a world where Islamic law theoretically forbids certain acts, but where palace walls create their own zones of exception. This is Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate, or perhaps Cairo under the Mamluks, or maybe Istanbul when the Ottoman Empire stretches across 3 continents, because the pattern you're following repeats across centuries of Islamic civilization, with variations that matter less than the underlying continuity. The call to prayer echoes across rooftops, reminding everyone of divine law and coming judgment, while inside these particular chambers a different set of rules applies, unwritten but thoroughly understood. The tension between religious prohibition and elite practice creates a space of cognitive dissonance that gets managed through silence, euphemism, and the convenient blindness that power can purchase. The Quran explicitly condemns the act of Lot's people, the physical relations between men that earn divine destruction. Hadith literature, the collected sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, reinforces this prohibition with threats of punishment both earthly and eternal. Islamic jurisprudence across all major schools of law categorizes male-male physical contact as haram, forbidden, subject to severe penalties if proven through the stringent evidentiary standards that made actual prosecution rare. This is the official framework, the public theology that preachers reinforce and legal scholars elaborate in endless commentaries. It's also, in practice, a framework that elite men navigated around with strategies that ranged from careful discretion to brazen disregard. Medieval Arabic and Persian literature is suffused with appreciation for male beauty, particularly the beauty of beardless youths in that liminal stage between boyhood and manhood. Poetry from the Abbasid period describes beautiful cupbearers at wine parties with language so explicitly sensual that modern translators sometimes resort to euphemism to avoid acknowledging what's being described. Abu Nuwas, one of the most celebrated poets of the classical Arabic tradition, who lived in the 8th and 9th centuries, wrote ghazals, love poems, that praised boys with the same elaborate metaphors used in heterosexual love poetry. He compared a beloved youth's face to the full moon, his hair to chains that bound the poet in sweet captivity, his indifference to the cruelty that defined the beloved's role in Arabic love poetry. These weren't secret writings hidden from authorities. They were recited at court, collected in anthologies studied by students of literature. The cognitive dissonance between theological prohibition and literary celebration was managed by treating poetry as a separate realm where different rules applied, a space of permitted transgression. The historical records of caliphs and sultans occasionally mention beautiful young male attendants with the same matter-of-fact tone used for female concubines. Al-Amin, an Abbasid caliph who ruled from 809 to 833, was noted by chroniclers for his preference for male companions over the female concubines his position entitled him to. The historians recording this information express some disapproval, but the disapproval seems to focus more on Al-Amin's neglect of procreative duty than on the relationships themselves. He had male favourites dressed as girls, according to some sources, an attempt to make the relationship appear more acceptable by introducing feminine presentation even while the object of desire remained male. Whether this actually fooled anyone or simply provided a fig leaf of deniability is unclear, but the practice suggests anxiety about appearance even when the reality was broadly known. The Turkish and Circassian slave boys who served in various Islamic courts occupied a category remarkably similar to the Persian cupbearers and Greek Romanoi you've already encountered. They were purchased young, often from slave markets that specialised in providing beautiful youths to elite households. Their training emphasised refined arts, calligraphy, music, poetry, the proper way to serve wine or coffee, the cultivation of graceful movement and pleasing conversation. The most beautiful might serve in the private quarters of the caliph or sultan, their official duties vague enough to encompass whatever their master required. Ottoman sources refer to Iolan, inner boys, who served in the palace's most private sections, their proximity to the sultan carefully regulated but undeniably intimate. What made the Islamic context particularly complex was the legal and theological framework that condemned the very relationships that were being practiced at the highest levels of society. Christian and Jewish traditions also prohibited male-male physical contact, but the enforcement mechanisms and the intensity of theological concern varied. Islamic jurisprudence devoted considerable intellectual energy to defining and prohibiting these acts, creating a body of law that was detailed and severe. Yet this same legal tradition existed in societies where court poets celebrated beautiful boys and where rulers maintained male favourites with barely concealed obviousness. The resolution of this contradiction happened through a kind of public-private split. What occurred behind palace walls remained officially unknown, and what remained officially unknown didn't require official response. You're watching as a young slave, perhaps 14 years old with the fair skin and refined features that commanded premium prices in the markets, is prepared for presentation to a provincial governor. He's been bathed in hammams with water heated to exact temperatures, his skin scrubbed smooth and then oiled with mixtures containing musk and ambergris. His hair has been arranged in the style currently fashionable at court, information that reached this provincial capital through networks of merchants and travellers. He wears a robe of fine cotton, subtle enough to suggest modesty, while the cut and drape emphasise his slender form. Unlike the Persian cupbearer you watched earlier, this youth's presentation doesn't include cosmetics or jewellery that might mark him too obviously as a physical object. The Islamic context requires more discretion, more ability to claim that his role is purely service-oriented, even when everyone understands otherwise. The governor who will receive him is a man of late middle age, pious enough to have funded a new mosque in the city centre, wealthy enough to maintain a household that includes multiple wives and numerous slaves. His acquisition of this beautiful youth will be recorded in household accounts under a category so general it could mean almost anything: purchase of domestic servant, cost noted alongside expenditures for horses and carpets. If anyone questions the price, which seems excessive for ordinary domestic help, the explanation will reference the boy's literacy or his training in music or some other skill that justifies the expense without acknowledging the primary reason for the purchase. This dance of plausible deniability is performed constantly, a social agreement that certain things won't be named directly even when they're perfectly visible. Sufi poetry adds another layer of complexity to this landscape. Mystical literature from Islamic traditions frequently uses the imagery of human love, including love for beautiful youths, as a metaphor for divine love. The beloved whose beauty torments the poet becomes a symbol for God, whose presence both attracts and eludes. This allegorical reading provides cover for poetry that might otherwise be too explicitly homosexual. A poem that describes yearning for a beautiful boy's attention can be read as spiritual allegory, the earthly love a pale shadow of the soul's desire for union with the divine. Whether the poets intended purely spiritual meaning or were also describing actual desire for actual boys is a question that scholars debate, and that probably can't be answered definitively, because the poets themselves might not have distinguished sharply between the two. Persian miniature paintings from the Safavid and Mughal periods show beautiful youths in garden settings, serving wine to older men, their poses suggesting availability even when nothing explicitly intimate is depicted. These paintings accompanied manuscripts of poetry, illustrating scenes that readers would have understood as charged with sensual potential. The youth pouring wine for the older man isn't just performing a service, but participating in a ritual of seduction that the viewer is invited to appreciate aesthetically, while also understanding its practical dimensions. The paintings exist in collections that also include images of heterosexual couples, of battles and hunts and religious scenes, the homosexualism integrated into the visual culture rather than segregated as a separate category requiring special justification. The legal scholar who owns such a manuscript might also write treatises condemning liwat, the legal term for male-male intercourse, prescribing harsh punishments that would rarely be applied. The same man might also own a beautiful slave boy who sleeps in quarters adjacent to his own, whose presence at evening gatherings is expected, whose function everyone understands without it needing to be stated. The contradiction is managed through careful attention to boundaries. Public theology maintains clear prohibitions. Private practice operates in spaces those prohibitions don't quite reach, either because they happen behind walls that create zones of privacy, or because the individuals involved have enough power that enforcement becomes impractical. Travellers' accounts from European visitors to Islamic courts frequently mention the presence of beautiful young male attendants, usually with a tone of scandalized fascination. These accounts need to be read carefully, because European observers had their own agendas, often using descriptions of Islamic practices to construct narratives of Oriental decadence that justified European superiority. But the consistency of these observations across different time periods and different observers suggests they're not purely invented. European ambassadors describe being entertained at banquets where beautiful youths served wine, where the host's favourites sat in positions of honour, where the homosexualism was apparent enough that foreign visitors noticed and commented. The young slave being prepared for the governor won't appear in history books. His name won't be recorded, his thoughts and feelings unknowable across the centuries. He's a footnote at best, mentioned in an account book, or perhaps appearing unnamed in a poem, as a generic beautiful youth whose specific identity matters less than his function as an object of desire. He might serve the governor for a few years until his beauty fades, or a newer acquisition displaces him. He might be freed eventually, his manumission a final gift, or he might remain enslaved, transitioning to less intimate service as he ages. His survival depends on navigating the space between the governor's desire and the religious framework that condemns that desire, on being available without being too obviously intimate, on providing satisfaction while maintaining the fiction that something else entirely is happening. You're entering the Topkapi Palace now, its walls rising above the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia meet in water that has carried empires for millennia. The Ottoman court represents perhaps the most elaborate and institutionalized version of the system you've been tracing, a place where the harem wasn't just the domain of women, but included parallel structures for beautiful young men whose presence was woven into the fabric of imperial administration. The year might be the 16th century during Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, or perhaps the 17th, when the empire still commanded fear and respect across 3 continents, before the slow decline that would eventually reduce it to the sick man of Europe. The palace sprawls across acres, its different sections segregated by function and access, and somewhere in the inner courts, away from the public ceremonies and administrative offices, young men are being trained in arts that have nothing to do with warfare or governance and everything to do with pleasing the Sultan. The Iolan system, the institution of inner boys, was one of the most distinctive features of Ottoman court life. These were youths recruited primarily through the devrim, the child levy that took Christian boys from Balkan families, converted them to Islam, and trained them for various forms of imperial service. The most intelligent and robust became janissaries, the elite infantry that formed the backbone of Ottoman military power. The most beautiful, particularly those with refined features and graceful bearing, entered the palace school where they were trained as pages. The official curriculum emphasized literacy, religious education, Turkish and Persian language, calligraphy, and courtly manners. The unofficial curriculum, never written down but thoroughly understood, taught these boys how to move through spaces of power, how to read the moods of superiors, how to make themselves desirable while maintaining the appearance of humble service. The palace pages were organised in strict hierarchy within different chambers, each with specific functions. The Has-Oda, the privy chamber, housed the most elite pages who served the Sultan directly in his most private spaces. These young men, usually between the ages of 14 and 25, attended the Sultan during his leisure hours, served his meals, managed his wardrobe, and accompanied him to the baths. Their physical proximity to the Sultan was unprecedented for anyone outside the immediate imperial family. They slept in rooms adjacent to the Sultan's chambers. They saw him in states of undress and vulnerability that no foreign ambassador or grand vizier ever witnessed. This intimacy created relationships that ranged from paternal affection to something considerably more charged, and the sources suggest that the full spectrum existed, depending on the particular sultan and the particular page. European observers were fascinated and horrified in roughly equal measure by the Iolan system. Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, the Habsburg ambassador to the Ottoman court in the mid-16th century, wrote detailed letters describing the palace pages with a combination of aesthetic appreciation and moral disapproval. He noted their exceptional beauty, their elaborate training, and the obvious favouritism shown to certain youths by Sultan Suleiman. Busbecq's descriptions emphasise the pages' feminine appearance, their smooth faces and graceful movements, though he's careful to note that these youths could also handle weapons and ride horses with martial skill. The combination of beauty and capability seems to have particularly unsettled him, challenging categories he thought were stable. Ottoman miniature paintings show these pages in contexts that make their function clear to anyone willing to look. A sultan reclines in a garden pavilion, while beautiful youths attend him, one holding a fan, another offering sherbet, a third simply sitting nearby in a pose that suggests decorative purpose. The compositions echo Persian paintings you've already encountered, part of a continuous artistic tradition that depicted elite male homosociality and homosensualism with remarkable consistency. Some miniatures show the Sultan in the hammam, the bath, attended by pages whose nudity is depicted with the same artistic attention given to any other subject. These weren't hidden images squirreled away in private collections. They appeared in official manuscripts, visual records of court life that presented the page's intimate service as a normal feature of imperial routine. The favouritism certain sultans showed particular pages created political complications that chronicles recorded with varying degrees of discretion. Mehmed the Conqueror, who captured Constantinople in 1453 and transformed it into the Ottoman capital, was known for his attachment to a page of extraordinary beauty. The sources describe the Sultan's grief when this youth died, a mourning that exceeded what would be expected for a mere servant. Later sultans demonstrated similar attachments, elevating favoured pages to positions of administrative responsibility that their age and experience didn't justify. A young man who had pleased the Sultan in private chambers might find himself appointed to a governorship or given command of military units. His advancement a source of resentment among more qualified candidates who understood exactly how he'd earned imperial favour. The system's genius, from an administrative perspective, was how it channeled sexuality into structures of loyalty. The Deverne boys were removed from their birth families, converted to a new religion, and raised entirely within imperial institutions. They had no competing loyalties, no alternative power bases, no family connections that might threaten the dynasty. Their entire existence depended on imperial favour, which made them theoretically more reliable than hereditary nobility with independent resources. The intimate dimension of some of these relationships intensified the bond, creating intimacies that translated into political trust. A sultan who had known a page in his most vulnerable moments might trust that page with information or responsibilities he wouldn't grant to more traditionally qualified candidates. You're watching as a new group of pages arrives at the palace, boys between 12 and 15, their Christian names being replaced with Turkish ones as part of the conversion process. They're terrified and trying to hide it, their eyes wide as they take in the palace's overwhelming splendour. Most of them come from villages where the grandest building was a small church, and now they're standing in courtyards tiled with Iznik ceramics that cost more than their entire village's annual production. They're being assessed by senior officials who examine them with the practiced eye of people evaluating merchandise. This one has good bone structure, but is too short. That one has beautiful eyes, but his nose is slightly crooked. This one, with his fair skin and delicate features, is exceptional, worth investing in, worth the intensive training that will transform him from a Balkan peasant's son into an ornament of the imperial court. The training that follows is comprehensive and dehumanizing in equal measure. The boys learn to subordinate their wills entirely to the hierarchy they've entered. They learn Turkish and Persian, languages that will allow them to serve effectively. They learn calligraphy until their hands ache, because beautiful handwriting is valued in a court that treats aesthetic refinement as a marker of civilization. They learn music, particularly instruments appropriate for intimate settings, the ney flute, the oud, the kemeny. They learn poetry, memorizing verses in languages they're still learning to speak. They learn to walk with a particular gliding gait considered graceful, to hold their bodies in ways that emphasize their slenderness, to arrange their faces in expressions of pleasant neutrality that can shift to admiration or sympathy as the situation requires. The intimate training isn't formalized or discussed explicitly, but it happens nonetheless through a system of mentorship where older pages instruct younger ones in arts that can't be found in any official curriculum. A boy learns what pleases, what to expect, how to endure. He learns that his body isn't entirely his own anymore, that it's a tool in service of larger purposes, and that successful deployment of that tool can lead to wealth and power that would otherwise be unimaginable for someone of his origins. He learns to dissociate, to perform intimacy, while keeping some core part of himself separate and protected. The ones who can't manage this dissociation break in various ways, becoming either too emotionally attached or too obviously resentful, either of which can be fatal to their prospects. Some pages navigated the system brilliantly, parlaying their years of intimate service into careers of genuine power. Ibrahim Pasha, who rose to become Suleiman the Magnificent's Grand Vizier, had started as a palace page, his exceptional beauty noted in multiple sources. His intimacy with Suleiman, beginning when both were young, created a bond that survived Ibrahim's elevation to the highest administrative office in the empire. Other former favourites became provincial governors, military commanders, or wealthy men who retired with fortunes accumulated through gifts and strategic investments. These success stories were held up as inspiration to new pages, proof that the system offered genuine opportunities for advancement to those who played it skillfully. The failures were less often discussed, but more numerous. Pages who aged out of desirability without having secured positions of lasting value found themselves discarded, given minor administrative posts in distant provinces, or simply released with minimal pension. The psychological toll of years spent as an intimate object, valued primarily for physical attributes that inevitably faded, left many former pages damaged in ways the sources don't explore, but that you can imagine easily enough. Depression, alcoholism, the inability to form relationships not based on transaction, the haunting sense of having sold something essential for rewards that turned out to be temporary, all these would have been common among men whose youth had been consumed by the system. The Ottoman model made explicit what other courts left implicit, creating formal structures for what elsewhere happened through informal arrangements. The Aeolian system, with its hierarchies and training programs, represented the full institutionalization of male concubinage, the transformation of an individual practice into a state apparatus. This formalization didn't make it less exploitative, but it did create possibilities for advancement that purely informal favoritism might not have offered. A page who caught the Sultan's eye knew there were established pathways for translating that attention into lasting position, protocols for promotion that meant today's favourite might become tomorrow's governor. The system was brutal and dehumanizing, but it was also, in its own terrible way, rational and predictable, which made it survivable for those with enough beauty, intelligence, and psychological resilience to navigate its demands. You're kneeling now on tatami mats, in a room where shoji screens filter sunlight into soft geometric patterns, where the air carries the scent of green tea and incense, where silence itself feels like a practiced art. This is Japan during the Edo period, or perhaps earlier during the Sengoku era, when warlords carved the country into competing domains, because the patterns you're tracing here stretch across centuries of Japanese history, with variations that matter less than the underlying continuity. The relationship between samurai and their younger male companions existed within a cultural framework called shudo or wakashudo, the way of youths, a tradition that was discussed openly in military chronicles, celebrated in woodblock prints, and regulated by codes of conduct that attempted to distinguish honourable from shameful forms of these bonds. Unlike the systems you've witnessed in Islamic courts where religious prohibition created zones of necessary silence, Japanese warrior culture incorporated male-male intimacy into its ideals of loyalty and martial virtue. The relationship between an adult samurai, the ninja, and a younger partner, the wakashu, was understood as pedagogical and hierarchical, but also deeply emotional and often intimate. The wakashu were adolescent males, usually between roughly 12 and 18, recognised by their distinctive hairstyle where the forelock remained unshaved, marking them as not yet fully adult. This liminal status made them objects of desire in ways that adult men were not. Their youth and beauty celebrated in literature and art with the same appreciation that other cultures reserved exclusively for women. A samurai would take a wakashu as something between a squire and a lover, responsible for the youth's training in martial arts and strategy, while also engaging in a relationship that included physical intimacy. The arrangement was formalized in some cases through ceremonies that resembled marriage, with the exchange of vows and gifts that bound the partners to mutual loyalty. Military chronicles from the Sengoku period describe these relationships with matter-of-fact acceptance as part of warrior life. The bond between the ninja and wakashu was expected to intensify loyalty, the intimacy creating connections that would hold firm in battle when men fought back-to-back against overwhelming odds. A samurai who had sworn to protect his wakashu would fight with particular ferocity to prevent his beloved's capture or death. The wakashu, for his part, was expected to demonstrate courage that would honour his ninja, to avoid bringing shame through cowardice or failure. This framework transformed intimate relationships into military assets, intimacy deployed in service of battlefield effectiveness in ways that seem strange to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense within a warrior culture that valued male bonds above almost everything else. Ihara Saikaku, a 17th century writer, produced works that explored shudo with explicit detail that would have been censored in most contemporary European contexts. His collection The Great Mirror of Male Love includes 40 stories depicting relationships between men and youths, ranging from Buddhist monasteries to kabuki theatres to samurai households. Saikaku writes about these relationships with the same narrative techniques he used for hetero-intimate romance, depicting jealousy and longing, successful seductions and tragic separations, the entire emotional range of intimate human connection. The stories present shudo as a normal feature of Japanese life, practiced across social classes, generating the same complications and satisfactions as any other form of love. Some stories celebrate faithful devotion that lasts beyond death. Others mock older men who chase after youths with undignified desperation. The moral framework isn't about the gender of the participants, but about whether the relationship embodies the virtues of loyalty, sincerity, and appropriate conduct. The kabuki theatre added another dimension to this landscape, one that blurred the line between artistic performance and intimate commerce in ways that authorities found alternately fascinating and troubling. Kabuki had originally featured female performers, but in 1629 the Tokugawa shogunate banned women from the stage, ostensibly because their presence led to prostitution and disturbed public morals. The ban didn't eliminate the problem, but simply redirected it. Kabuki became the domain of male actors, including wakashu, who performed female roles with such skill that audiences found them as sensually compelling as actual women had been. These young actors, called onagata when performing female roles, became objects of intense admiration and desire, their images reproduced in woodblock prints that collectors treasured. The theatres became sites of transaction, where wealthy patrons could arrange meetings with beautiful young actors whose stage performances were understood as advertisements for their availability off-stage. A merchant might attend kabuki regularly, developing a fascination with a particular wakashu performer, eventually arranging through intermediaries to sponsor the youth. The sponsorship would involve financial support, gifts of expensive kimono and accessories, and in return the actor would provide companionship that included intimate access. This was concubinage in all but name, though the framing emphasized the patron's aesthetic appreciation and the actor's artistic merit, rather than reducing the relationship to crude transaction. The system allowed wealthy men who weren't samurai to participate in shudo culture, purchasing access to beautiful youths in ways that merchant wealth made possible. You're watching as a young kabuki actor prepares for performance, his face being painted white with powders that transform his features into a mask of stylized beauty. He's perhaps 15, his forelock still marking him as wakashu, his movements studied and graceful from years of training that began in childhood. After tonight's performance, he'll meet with a wealthy rice merchant who has been courting him for weeks, sending gifts and letters written in calligraphy that cost money to have composed. The actor knows what's expected, what the merchant wants beyond the pleasure of conversation. He's negotiating through intermediaries for terms that will provide him security, perhaps a house of his own, perhaps capital to invest in his own theatrical troupe eventually. His beauty is his capital, his youth the asset he's investing while it retains value. Buddhist monasteries provided yet another context for these relationships, one that created its own peculiar tensions between religious ideals and human desires. Young acolytes training to become monks often formed relationships with older monks that the monastic literature sometimes condemned and sometimes tacitly accepted, depending on the sect and the period. The nanshoku, male colours, a euphemistic term for male-male intimateity, appears in Buddhist writings with anxiety about how these attachments might distract from spiritual practice, or, alternatively, with arguments that such relationships could be disciplined into forms that supported rather than undermined religious devotion. Some monasteries attempted to regulate these relationships through rules that specified appropriate and inappropriate conduct, trying to channel desire into frameworks that wouldn't completely disrupt monastic discipline. The Zen monk Ikkyu, who lived in the 15th century and became legendary for his unconventional approach to Buddhism, wrote poems celebrating his attraction to young acolytes with playful directness. He described desire as a natural human experience that monks should acknowledge rather than deny, though he also wrote about the spiritual dangers of attachment. His poetry doesn't resolve the tension between desire and detachment, but sits with it, presenting both the pleasure of intimacy and the recognition that such pleasure creates bonds that complicate the goal of non-attachment. The fact that Ikkü's writings were preserved and celebrated rather than suppressed suggests that his approach, while unconventional, wasn't entirely outside acceptable discourse. What distinguished Japanese Shudo from most of the systems you've examined in other cultures was its relative openness and its integration into codes of honour rather than operating despite them. A samurai's relationship with his wakashu wasn't a secret vice, but a recognised bond that other samurai would understand and often respect. The literature celebrating these relationships wasn't underground or coded, but mainstream, produced by respected authors, illustrated by master artists, consumed by audiences across social classes. This doesn't mean the relationships were egalitarian or free from exploitation. The age difference and power imbalance meant that wakashu were often in vulnerable positions, dependent on their nenja for protection and advancement, their consent complicated by the hierarchies that structured every aspect of their lives. The system also had clear boundaries that, when violated, could result in serious consequences. A wakashu was expected to be faithful to his nenja for the duration of their bond. If he accepted advances from another man, it was considered a betrayal that could justify violence. Stories from the period describe nenja killing wakashu who had been unfaithful, or fighting duels with rival samurai who had attempted to seduce their partners. The jealousy and possessiveness that structured these relationships reveal that for all the elevated language about loyalty and virtue, these were also relationships of ownership, where the wakashu's intimate autonomy was controlled by the senior partner. When the wakashu aged beyond the acceptable range, usually signalled by the ceremony where his forelock was finally shaved and he was recognised as an adult man, the relationship was expected to transition into something more equal, a brotherhood of former intimates, though sources suggest this. Transition wasn't always smooth. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan from 1603 to 1868, occasionally attempted to regulate Shudo when it seemed to threaten social order, particularly the theatre-centred prostitution that involved wakashu actors. Sumptuary laws restricted the clothing kabuki actors could wear off stage, attempting to prevent them from dressing in ways that advertised their availability. Regulations tried to separate theatre districts from residential areas, creating zones where such activities were contained. But these regulatory efforts never attempted to eliminate Shudo entirely, only to manage its most disruptive manifestations. The practice was too thoroughly woven into warrior culture, too celebrated in literature and art, too fundamental to how male intimacy and loyalty were understood to be eradicated through legislation. You're standing now in a cold stone corridor where torchlight flickers against walls thick enough to withstand siege, where the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies mingles with the damp that never quite leaves medieval architecture. This is a castle somewhere in Europe, the specific location less important than the pattern, because what you're about to witness happened in England and France, in the German principalities and the Italian city-states, in Christian kingdoms that officially condemned same-gender relations with, penalties that range from penance to execution, while simultaneously creating spaces where beautiful young men served noblemen in capacities that everyone understood but nobody officially acknowledged. The silence around these relationships in European historical records is thicker than elsewhere, the erasure more complete, because later centuries needed their medieval past to look a certain way, and male concubines complicated narratives of Christian virtue and chivalric romance. The page system that structured noble households throughout medieval Europe created perfect cover for relationships that couldn't be openly acknowledged. Boys from lesser noble families, or from the families of wealthy merchants, were sent to serve in great households as part of their education. They learned courtly manners, martial skills, literacy if the household valued it, and the complex etiquette that governed aristocratic life. They served at table, attended their lords in private chambers, accompanied them on hunts and military campaigns, and slept in rooms adjacent to, or sometimes within, their lord's quarters. The official purpose was educational, transforming boys into proper noblemen through proximity to exemplary figures. The actual practice created opportunities for intimacy that some lords exploited with the same sense of entitlement that made them feel free to take liberties with serving girls. Unlike the Japanese Shudo system, which had explicit codes and literary traditions celebrating these bonds, or the Ottoman Iolan system with its formal hierarchies, European arrangements operated in shadows created by Christian intimate morality that left no sanctioned space for such relationships. The theological framework was unambiguous. Same-gender relations was a sin against nature, condemned in scripture and elaborated in centuries of church teaching as particularly abhorrent, because it perverted the natural purpose of intimacy. The legal penalties in most European jurisdictions were severe, at least in theory. England's Buggery Act of 1533 made same-gender relations punishable by death, a law that remained on the books for centuries. Medieval law codes across Europe prescribed burning, castra, or burial alive for those convicted of the sin against nature. Yet prosecutions were relatively rare, and when they did occur, they almost always involved either political enemies being destroyed through convenient charges or lower-class individuals without the protection that rank provided. The evidentiary standards for same-gender relations charges were deliberately high, requiring witnesses or confession, and the nature of the act meant that it typically occurred in private, where witnesses were unlikely. This gap between severe theoretical penalties and rare practical enforcement created space for practice that couldn't be acknowledged. A lord could maintain a beautiful page in circumstances that everyone around him understood, while remaining technically immune from formal accusation, as long as he was discreet enough to avoid creating undeniable public scandal. The chronicles and letters that survive from medieval Europe occasionally provide glimpses of these relationships through careful euphemism or hostile accusation. When political enemies wanted to destroy someone, accusations of same-gender relations were effective weapons precisely because they were so severe and so difficult to definitively disprove. Edward II of England, who ruled from 1307 to 1327, provides perhaps the most documented example of a medieval king whose relationships with male favourites created political crises. His attachment to Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight, was so intense and so obviously intimate in the eyes of contemporary observers that it destabilised his reign. Chronicles describe Edward showering Gaveston with titles, lands and honours that offended the English nobility. They describe the two men sharing beds, embracing publicly, demonstrating affection that exceeded what friendship could explain. The language the chronicles use is interesting, because it dances around direct accusation while making the implications clear. They describe Edward's love for Gaveston as immoderate and beyond measure, as transgressing the bounds of natural affection. They note that Edward preferred Gaveston's company to that of his queen, Isabella of France, neglecting his marital duties in favour of time with his favourite. These descriptions rely on the audience understanding what couldn't be stated explicitly. The chronicles were written by clerics who couldn't directly accuse a king of same-gender relations without evidence, but could imply it through descriptions of excessive attachment and inappropriate intimacy. The political dimension mattered more than the physical dimension. Edward's barons eventually executed Gaveston, not because he was the king's lover, but because his influence threatened their own power. The intimate relationship simply the mechanism through which an unsuitable favourite had gained unacceptable authority. After Gaveston's death, Edward formed a similar attachment to Hugh Despenser the Younger, another favourite who accumulated power through royal affection, and met a similarly violent end when Edward's enemies finally triumphed. The pattern reveals how male favourites functioned in medieval European politics. There were vulnerabilities, points where emotional attachment created exploitable weaknesses. A king who loved a man created a target that enemies could attack, knowing that the king's response would be emotionally rather than strategically motivated. The intimate dimension intensified the political liability, because it couldn't be openly defended. Edward couldn't say "I love this man" and therefore elevate him without admitting to sin. He had to frame his favouritism in other terms, as reward for loyal service, but the transparent flimsiness of these justifications, when Gaveston and Despenser clearly lacked merit proportionate to their elevation, undermined Edward's authority. You're walking through the castle now toward the Lord's chambers, where a page, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, is laying out clothing for the morning. He's the youngest son of a minor baron, sent here 2 years ago to learn courtly ways, and he's beautiful in the way that some adolescent boys are, before their features harden into masculine angularity. The lord of this castle is perhaps 40, a widower, pious enough to endow a chapel, but not so pious that it interferes with his appetites. What happens between them occurs in the hours between Compline and Lords, in darkness, where what can't be seen can be denied. The page has learnt not to resist, has learned that compliance brings rewards in the form of better clothing, occasional gifts, perhaps eventually a position in the household that will provide income. He's also learned that speaking about what happens would destroy him more certainly than it would destroy the Lord, that accusations flow downhill, and a boy claiming abuse by a nobleman would be dismissed or punished for slander. The monastic context provided another venue for these relationships, one that created even more intense contradictions between stated ideals and actual practice. Monasteries were supposed to be spaces of celibacy and spiritual discipline, men withdrawing from worldly temptation to devote themselves to prayer and contemplation. They were also communities of men living in close quarters, many of them having entered religious life as children, their intimacy developing entirely within all male environments. The combination created situations where intimate relationships formed despite or perhaps because of the celibacy rules. Monastic rules from various orders include provisions attempting to prevent particular friendships between monks, regulations about sleeping arrangements designed to minimise opportunity for intimate contact, penalties for those discovered in compromising situations. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived in the 11th century and became one of medieval Christianity's most important theologians, wrote letters to younger monks that modern readers find remarkably affectionate, filled with language of longing and devotion that exceeds what we typically consider, appropriate for spiritual mentorship. Whether these relationships were physically sexual or remained in the realm of passionate but celibate friendship is debated by scholars, but the intensity of feeling is undeniable. Anselm writes about yearning to see a particular young monk, about the pain of separation, about love that he describes as both spiritual and deeply personal. The letters exist in a space between acknowledged homosocial bonds that medieval Christianity permitted and homosexual attachments that it condemned, the ambiguity perhaps deliberate. Aelred of Rievaulx, a 12th century Cistercian abbot, wrote a treatise called Spiritual Friendship that attempted to theorize a form of intense male bond that would be spiritually valuable rather than sinful. He drew on Cicero's classical discussion of friendship, but Christianized it, arguing that friendship between men could be a path to divine love if properly disciplined and directed. Reading Aelred's work, you can sense him working through his own experiences and desires, trying to create a framework that would allow for the passionate attachments he felt, while avoiding the condemnation that same-gender relations incurred. The treatise became influential in monastic circles, providing a vocabulary for relationships that might otherwise have lacked legitimate language. The artistic patronage of certain medieval and Renaissance noblemen sometimes reveals their preferences through the subjects they commissioned. A lord who consistently commissioned paintings or sculptures of beautiful young men, who filled his palace with images of Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows or David in his youth, might be expressing desires that couldn't be stated more directly. The plausible deniability that religious and classical subjects provided allowed for the celebration of male beauty within frameworks that were officially acceptable. A painting of Saint Sebastian was devotional art, but it also depicted a beautiful, nearly naked youth in a pose of submission and suffering, that it might serve other purposes for the patron beyond spiritual edification. Remained unspoken but perhaps not entirely unnoticed by those with eyes to see. The records are fragmentary because later generations systematically destroyed evidence of practices that embarrassed them. Letters were burned, diary entries redacted, chronicles edited to remove implications that reflected poorly on ancestors or national character. Victorian scholars who catalogued medieval archives made decisions about what to preserve and what to discard, and material suggesting that medieval noblemen kept male concubines often ended up discarded. What survives does so almost accidentally, in sources that were hostile and therefore preserved the accusations they meant as slander, or in materials that weren't recognised as significant until modern scholars with different questions began examining them. You're standing in a market square where the morning sun hasn't yet burned away the night's chill, where vendors are setting up stalls with vegetables and cloth and livestock, and off to one side, in a space that draws both furtive glances and determined avoidance, human beings are being sold. This is a slave market, and the specific location could be almost anywhere across the time periods you've been traversing. It might be Baghdad in the 9th century, or Constantinople in the 12th, or Cairo in the 15th, or one of the North African ports where corsairs brought captives from Mediterranean raids. The mechanics of the trade varied by region and period, but the underlying reality remained constant. Beauty was assessed, priced and sold, and among the merchandise being evaluated were boys and young men whose primary value lay in their appearance, and the uses to which that appearance could be put. The traders who specialised in this particular market segment developed expertise in predicting what would sell and to whom. They looked for specific features that different cultures prized. Fair skin commanded premium prices in markets where most of the population was darker, the rarity increasing value. Delicate features, large eyes, and a build that was slender rather than heavily muscled indicated a youth destined for domestic or intimate service rather than hard labour. The traders assessed bone structure with the calculating eye of people who understood that beauty was their inventory and condition affected price. A boy with exceptional looks might be reserved for wealthy buyers, shown privately rather than displayed in the general market, his sale negotiated with the discretion that high-value transactions required. The sources of supply were distressingly varied. Warfare provided a steady stream, captured populations including children who could be enslaved under laws that most societies accepted as normal spoils of conquest. The diverm system you encountered in the Ottoman context was a formalised version, a tax paid in children, but less formal versions existed wherever armies moved through territory. Poverty supplied another stream, families selling children they couldn't feed, the transaction framed as giving the child better opportunities even as everyone understood the likely reality. Kidnapping provided a third source, raiders targeting areas where law enforcement was weak, children simply disappearing and reappearing hundreds of miles away in markets where no one would recognise them or credit their claims of free birth. The boys being sold understood their situation with varying degrees of clarity depending on their age and how they'd arrived at this point. A child of 8 or 9 might not fully grasp what was happening, might still believe the lies about being taken to a better situation, might not yet understand what being beautiful meant in this context. A youth of 14 or 15 knew exactly what the buyers were assessing when they examined his face and body, knew that the questions about his health and temperament were evaluating him as an intimate commodity, knew that his future depended entirely on who purchased him and for what purpose. The knowledge was written in their faces if you knew how to read it, a combination of fear and resignation, and sometimes a terrible calculation about how to make the best of circumstances they couldn't control. The buyers moved through the market with different levels of openness about their intentions. A merchant looking for household servants might examine several youths, checking their teeth like horses, feeling their muscles to assess strength, asking them to perform simple tasks to demonstrate competence. A buyer seeking a concubine was often more discreet, conducting the examination in a private area, the physical inspection more intimate and degrading. In some markets, Youths designated for intimate service were displayed separately, sometimes in states of undress that made their purpose unmistakable. In other markets, the discretion was thicker, the intimate dimension understood but never explicitly stated, the transaction conducted in euphemisms about domestic service and personal attendance. The pricing reflected brutal hierarchies of desirability. A beautiful youth with fair skin and refined features might cost as much as a skilled craftsman or a trained horse, a sum that represented months or years of income for a common person. A less attractive boy, or one whose age was approaching the point where he'd be considered an adult man, cost considerably less. His value diminished by failing to meet the specific criteria that the market for concubines demanded. The most expensive were sometimes those who combined beauty with education, youths who had been enslaved from formerly wealthy families and who brought literacy or musical training alongside their physical appeal. These represented investments that wealthy buyers made expecting returns in the form of both pleasure and status, a beautiful educated companion being a marker of refined taste. You're watching as a boy of perhaps 13 is brought forward for a potential buyer's inspection. He's been bathed and his hair arranged by the slave trader's assistants, his presentation calculated to maximize appeal. His eyes are downcast in the posture slaves were taught, but you can see terror in the tension of his shoulders, in the way his hands clench and unclench at his sides. The buyer is a middle-aged man in expensive robes, his demeanour businesslike as he examines the merchandise. He asks the trader questions about the boy's origins, his health, whether he's been trained in any useful skills. The boy is told to turn, to lift his arms, to open his mouth so his teeth can be checked. The examination is clinical and dehumanizing, reducing him to a collection of attributes to be assessed for value. The negotiation that follows is about price, not principle. The buyer isn't questioning whether it's acceptable to purchase a child for intimacy use, but whether this particular child is worth the asking price. He points out flaws, real or invented, to drive the price down. A slight scar, a tendency toward thinness, a sullen expression that might indicate difficult temperament. All these become leverage in negotiations. The trader counters with the boy's advantages, his exceptional eyes, his unblemished skin elsewhere, his young age that means years of service before he ages out of peak desirability. They settle on a price somewhere between the opening positions, money changes hands, and ownership transfers with the same casual efficiency that might govern the sale of a rug or a donkey. What happened to boys after purchase varied enormously depending on who bought them and for what purpose. Some entered households where they were treated with relative kindness, their masters viewing them as valued property worth maintaining in good condition. They might receive adequate food, decent clothing and treatment that, while fundamentally exploitative, wasn't actively cruel. Others found themselves in situations of systematic abuse, purchased by individuals whose desires ran to inflicting pain, whose intimate gratification was bound up with domination and suffering. The boy had no recourse, no appeal, no protection, beyond whatever minimal standards the society maintained for property treatment. In most legal systems, a master could do almost anything to a slave without facing consequences. The slave's testimony inadmissible in court, his injuries invisible to any mechanism of justice. Some of the purchased youths eventually earned freedom, either through formal manumission when their beauty faded and their masters tired of them, or through accumulating enough value that they could purchase their own freedom. The successful navigation of slavery required extraordinary psychological resilience, the ability to perform desirability and submission while maintaining enough sense of self to survive. Those who managed this transition, who moved from enslaved concubine to free person, carried scars that no amount of subsequent success could erase. The years of being used, of having no control over one's own body, of performing pleasure while experiencing violation, these experiences fundamentally shaped how survivors understood themselves and their relationships for the rest of their lives. Others never escaped. dying in slavery from disease, violence, or despair. Rates among enslaved concubines were likely high, though the sources rarely record such deaths with enough detail to distinguish intentional from accidental. A youth who threw himself from a roof or walked into the sea might be recorded simply as a property loss, the master's investment disappearing without any investigation into cause. The psychological toll of being valued only for beauty, of knowing that aging would render you worthless, of enduring repeated violation with no possibility of refusal, was crushing. That any survived psychologically intact is testament to human resilience. That many didn't survive is the predictable outcome of sustained dehumanization. The trade in beautiful boys existed alongside, and sometimes overlapped with the trade in girls and women for intimate purposes. But there were distinctions that mattered. Female concubines could produce children who might inherit or at least maintain some connection to the father. Male concubines generated different anxieties, their presence threatening established families not through biological reproduction, but through the diversion of resources and affection that wives and legitimate heirs expected to monopolize. The fears that male concubines generated in households were about favoritism and its consequences, about wealth and attention flowing to someone who couldn't even provide the justification of continuing the family line. The markets operated openly in societies that officially condemned the purposes for which many of these youths were being purchased. The cognitive dissonance was managed through the same mechanisms you've seen repeatedly: public condemnation coexisting with private practice, laws that were severe in theory but rarely enforced against elite offenders, and linguistic frameworks that allowed people to discuss domestic servants and personal attendance without explicitly acknowledging intimate service. The slave traders knew exactly what they were selling and to whom. The buyers knew exactly what they were purchasing. The societies that hosted these markets knew what was happening in them. The knowledge was general but unspoken, managed through a collective agreement not to examine too closely what was occurring in transactions that everyone could see. The mechanisms of the trade were supported by networks that spanned continents, merchants specializing in human cargo developing routes and contacts that paralleled those used for spices and silk. Information travelled along these networks about what specific markets demanded, what physical types were currently fashionable in which regions, what prices were sustainable. A trader in one city might receive word that fair-skinned youths were commanding exceptional prices in another city 1,000 miles away, and that information would shape his purchasing decisions when the next caravan of captives arrived. The market was responsive and sophisticated, adjusting to supply and demand with the same efficiency that governed trade in any other commodity. The boys themselves had no voice in these transactions, no ability to advocate for their own interests, beyond the small manipulations that powerless people developed to survive. A youth who understood that beauty was his only asset might cooperate with the trader's presentation, hoping that being purchased by a wealthy buyer would at least provide material security even if it meant intimate exploitation. Another might resist, refusing to cooperate with examinations, making himself difficult in hopes of reducing his value to buyers seeking compliant pleasure. The resistance rarely succeeded in preventing sale, but might affect where he ended up. The difficult ones sometimes purchased cheaply for hard labour, since they'd failed as candidates for intimate service. The traders managed their inventory with cold calculation. A boy who became ill might be disposed of quickly at reduced price, rather than risk him dying and representing total loss. A youth who showed signs of depression or suicidal ideation might be sold rapidly before he could damage himself and eliminate his value. The most beautiful were sometimes held back from general sale, reserved for wealthy buyers who could afford premium prices and who were cultivated as regular customers. These buyers might visit the traders' private facilities, where a select few youths were kept in better conditions, their value too high to risk in the general market's chaos. Some markets developed particular reputations for specific types. The markets of Central Asia were known for providing youths with features prized in Chinese courts, certain bone structures, certain colourings, certain builds that Chinese aesthetic traditions particularly valued. The markets of the Caucasus region supplied the Ottoman court with Circassian and Georgian youths, whose fair skin and refined features commanded extraordinary prices. North African markets drew from raids across the Mediterranean, Italian and Spanish boys ending up in households from Cairo to Marrakech, their European features marking them as exotic and valuable. The journey from capture or sale to final destination was itself traumatic. Boys transported in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to brutal. They might travel in caravans across deserts, in ships crossing seas, chained when their captors feared escape, kept in conditions barely adequate for survival because dead merchandise had no value. The psychological impact of being torn from everything familiar, transported to places where language and customs were alien, and sold to strangers for purposes they might not fully understand until too late. This trauma formed the foundation on which their futures as concubines would be built. The disorientation and fear made them more controllable, easier to shape into the compliant servants their purchasers demanded. What makes this history particularly difficult to confront is its scale and its ordinariness. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of a few aberrant individuals. This was institutional, systematic, normalized across most major civilizations throughout most of human history. The beautiful boys being sold in markets from Baghdad to Beijing, from Rome to Timbuktu, numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the centuries, possibly millions, each one representing an individual life consumed by a system that valued beauty as a commodity and children as potential property. The vast majority left no record, no trace beyond perhaps a single line in an account book noting their purchase price. They lived, they suffered, they died, and history moved on without registering their existence as worth preserving. The few voices that do survive, the occasional memoir or letter or court testimony where these youths speak for themselves, reveal the human cost in fragments that are almost unbearable in their brief clarity. A youth testifying in a medieval court case about abuse, his words recorded by a scribe who summarized rather than quoted directly. A poem written by a former concubine who learned literacy and used it to process experiences that had left him damaged in ways he struggled to articulate. A letter from a young man begging family members to ransom him from slavery, describing conditions that the family either couldn't or wouldn't act to change. These glimpses are rare precisely because the system worked to ensure these voices remained unheard, their experiences private, their suffering contained within walls that protected perpetrators rather than victims. The economic logic that sustained the trade was straightforward and brutal. Beauty had value because powerful people desired it and had resources to purchase access to it. Children and youths could be acquired relatively cheaply, either through capture or through transactions with families desperate enough to sell them. The potential return was substantial, a beautiful concubine potentially providing years of service and pleasure. If they aged out of desirability, they could be discarded or repurposed with minimal loss. If they died young, the investment was written off and replaced. The cold calculation that treated human beings as depreciating assets was articulated openly in household management texts from various cultures. Advice on how to maximize return on slave purchases discussed alongside tips for maintaining livestock. The trade eventually declined in most regions, as slavery itself came under attack during the 19th and 20th centuries, though the decline was uneven and incomplete. As formal slavery became illegal in more jurisdictions, the open markets where youths were sold for intimate purposes disappeared or went underground. The practice didn't vanish, but transformed, operating through mechanisms that didn't require legal slavery, indentured servitude, debt bondage, fraudulent labour contracts, and straightforward trafficking that violated laws now on the books but poorly enforced. The fundamental dynamic, powerful people purchasing access to beautiful vulnerable youths, survived the legal frameworks that had previously sanctioned it. adapting to new circumstances with depressing resilience. The silence that surrounds this history, the way it disappears from popular understanding even as evidence sits in archives waiting for scholars willing to examine it, reflects deep discomfort with acknowledging what our ancestors did and what desires drove them. It's easier to tell sanitized stories about ancient civilizations, to focus on their artistic achievements and philosophical developments, while quietly ignoring the slave markets that funded those achievements. It's easier to celebrate medieval chivalry and warrior codes, while overlooking the pages who served knights in capacities that official histories don't mention. The erasure serves present needs, allowing us to claim cultural inheritances without reckoning fully with the exploitation those cultures normalized. But the youths who passed through those markets, who stood on those platforms while strangers assessed their value, who spent years or decades as concubines in households where their consent was never sought and their refusal was impossible, they deserve to be remembered. Not as abstractions or statistics, but as individuals who endured what should never have been inflicted, who survived when they could and died when survival became impossible, whose beauty became their burden and whose youth was consumed by a system that treated them as renewable resources rather than as human beings with inherent worth and dignity. The boy you watched being sold earlier today has been led away by his new owner, his future now entirely dependent on the character and desires of a man he'd never met until an hour ago. He's walking through streets that are foreign to him, toward a house he's never seen, into a life he didn't choose and can't escape. Everything he was before this moment, whatever family he had, whatever dreams he might have entertained, whatever sense of self he'd begun to develop, all of that is being overwritten by his new status as property, as an object purchased for pleasure, as a beautiful thing to be used until his. Beauty fades and his usefulness expires. This happened countless times, in countless places, to countless boys whose names we'll never know. The markets are mostly gone now, but the memories they created, the trauma they inflicted, the lives they consumed, these echoes persist in ways we're only beginning to understand and acknowledge. Count: 1,448. Total word count for Section 10, 3016. Nodiel Kokomat Andust. End of script. The palaces are quieter now, their corridors empty of the footsteps that once moved through them with practiced grace. The boys who once reclined on silk cushions, who poured wine with hands that trembled, who learnt to perform desire while dying inside, they've all long since turned to dust. But perhaps, in remembering them, in refusing to let their erasure be complete, we offer something small across the vast distance of centuries, the recognition that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering was real even when the systems that inflicted it called it service, called it honour, called it anything but what it was. Rest now. Let these heavy truths settle gently as you drift towards sleep. History can wait until morning, and you've travelled far enough through these shadows for one night. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. You're safe here, in this moment, in this quiet space we've shared. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness, for caring enough to learn.